There have been some strange goings-on in the Something Who bunker tonight, and now I know who's been responsible. You all have. You've sabotaged this podcast.
What are you talking about?
You're the cause of this. You knocked me unconscious.
Don't be ridiculous. We were all knocked out.
A charade. You attacked me.
Absolute nonsense.
And when I was lying helpless on the floor, you recorded some material without me.
You can check the recordings yourself, and you won't find anything wrong with them.
And why would we? For what reason?
Blackmail. That's why. You want to force me to leave the podcast.
Oh, don't be so stupid.
I know it. I'm sure of it.
How dare you? Do you realise that the podcast would have sunk without trace if Paul hadn't given a detailed breakdown of all the writing decisions and curiosities in each story?
And what about Giles' discussion of symbolism and important cultural reference points?
You ought to get down on your hands and knees and thank us, but gratitude's the last thing you'll ever have.
Ah.
What is it?
I think I know what the problem is.
Really?
Well, it's only just over a fortnight since I uploaded the last episode of Something Who.
Okay, but so what?
Well, that's a pretty fast return, isn't it?
I guess so.
The podcast was spinning out of control on a collision course with disaster, but I flicked this switch and now everything's going to be totally fine.
That'll be a first.
Welcome to the podcast where we take something old, a Doctor Who story from the original series, compare it with something new, one from the new series, and add something borrowed, that sketch, to make Something Who. Hello, I'm Richard, and we're back with Something Who podcast, episode 70, where we discuss a couple of Doctor Who stories that question whether the TARDIS is sentient. First, we'll look at First Doctor story, The Edge of Destruction, or Inside the Spaceship, if you prefer, from the very first season, and after that we'll examine 11th Doctor Caper, the Doctor's Wife, from Series 6. And with me to decide whether these stories offer signs of independent thought or seem more mechanistic, we have writer, raconteur and missing episodes expert Paul. Hi, Paul.
Good evening.
Can we still say Happy New Year, or are we beyond that point, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's new since the last podcast and since we last spoke to each other, so yes, go for it.
Happy New Year.
You can't say that now, it's the middle of January.
Very good. Next up, we've got science and astronomy writer Giles.
Yes, Happy New Year. This is obviously the budget-saving episode where we've had to reduce the cast. We're just doing it with the regulars.
Oh, God, yeah.
We've had to amortise the cost of Simon over 13 episodes.
Yeah.
As long as you don't pad it out with any flashbacks to the last series.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I won't lie, but we thought we'd ease our way into 2023 with a couple of fairly short stories. It certainly minimised the research, didn't it?
Yes, for which I was very thankful. Because I hate Doctor Who.
Yeah. Well, look, let's start off with The Edge of Destruction. Well, that's what the first episode's called anyway, by David Whittaker. And it's so good that it has two directors, Richard Martin for the first episode and Frank Cox for the second, which was famously written in a hurry by the script editor, but not necessarily for the reasons that everyone seems to give in the accompanying documentary. Anyway, original coming across this, who's got the earliest of it? I mean, it came out in a Target book, I suppose, in the late 70s, early 80s?
Oh, blimey, it was quite a mid to late one. It was when Nigel Robinson was, when he was the editor of the range, he took it upon himself to write a lot of other stories that were nobody else had wanted to write or even release. He was mopping up all the rubbish, basically, and he did a very, very good job on all of them. I seem to remember the Time Meddler may not be included in that category, but he was, what else did he do? The Underwater Menace.
Right.
And I seem to remember he wrote at least one two-parter, and took the opportunity to expand it to the full 144 pages, and he made a very good job of the Edge of Destruction. if I'd had time, I would have reread it. But then I would have been even less pleased with the original version.
Yeah. I think my first encounter with it was Doctor Who Weekly, around about issue 4 or 5, I guess. It appeared up as one of their very early archive features. But I'm not sure that it's a plot that's very easy to summarise in that way, without making it look a little bit, well, I suppose what it is really, which is a little bit of a patchwork.
Was it called Beyond the Sun?
Yes, I think that's right.
I was going to
because that's my recollection is the DW Weekly.
Yeah, never mind Inside the Spaceship. I remember when it had borrowed a title from another mysterious story that may or may not have been written by Malcolm Hulk. I still, to this day, I can't remember how that all actually shakes down when you get to the bottom of it.
Then that got later tangled up in the whole infamous April Fool's joke, didn't it?
Yeah.
About them having found clips of it. But, yeah, it'll always be Beyond the Sun to me. It's a fairly...
Why has nobody written The Phoenix Rises yet after all this time? Surely somebody,
frankly,
a Big Finish or even unofficially.
Yes. Mm.
Well, there's a job for you, Paul.
Okay, all right. That is a list of ideas I've had during the podcast that I pretend I'm going to pitch to somebody.
Yeah.
1988, the book came out, so that.
Right, really late.
Okay.
That's why I haven't read it.
It's very good. You should read it. A nice cover as well. I'm just looking at it now. From the peak of Alistair Pearson, I would say he's blending the face into the background as he generally did, but it's nicely done. I didn't know this. I didn't read about it in Doctor Who Weekly, so this probably would have been the first time beyond the one paragraph explanation in the program guide. And then I saw it a couple of years later, possibly before many of you. I don't know, when did it come out on VHS?
Well, I don't know about that, but I didn't see it.
Research.
I didn't see it until the UK Gold. I watched it in about the late 90s. So that would be the first time I saw it. I'm
going to have to. This is going to be hit another of my occasional series of mentions of the fact that we had BSB, British Satellite Broadcasting.
Oh, wow.
So when they showed them all from the beginning in 1990, I was able to see a lot of very obscure season 1 stories before they then stopped. It was brilliant while it lasted, which wasn't very long.
Yeah, VHS wasn't until 2000 of all things, so it was one of the ones they left towards the end. I think I saw it either in a screening room or my friend Tim, who got hold of copies that came off B-Sky B, etc., or BSB, whatever they... So I think I probably saw it around that sort of time.
It was almost beaten out by the DVD, because that was only, 2003 or something. It was...
Yes, I definitely wouldn't have bought it on VHS, being at the tail end, where I famously stopped buying the videos because the DVDs had started. But I wouldn't have bought it anyway, because it's the edge of destruction. I think this was the story, as well as starting to show Doctor Who from the start in a regular slot on BSB. They then did the famous BSB Doctor Who Weekend, which was a wonderful thing. 48 hours of Doctor Who with lots of guests being pressed into service to be interviewed by John Nathan Turner, and they re-showed all the stories they'd already shown that weekend, and a few more. So it was a rather peculiar mixture of nobody's favourites like this and the Keys of Marinus and so on, plus a few really exciting things like Web of Fear Part 1. Anyway, never mind all that. I think this is the story where late at night, I think it finished off the Saturday evening, and they showed the 2 episodes out of order. And nobody noticed because everyone had gone home.
That would have really helped to make even more sense of it.
In the booth, and then they apologised for it the next day.
Did they show it again in the right order?
Oh, possibly. I can't
to make up for it.
I used to have the entire thing on a little pile of VHSs, and then I lent them to somebody and never saw them again.
The DVD was 2006, by the way, the beginning.
Oh, right.
Set.
Okay.
So,
anyway.
Right. Later than I thought then. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think in that case, the gaps between the times I've seen it have been enough that each time I've come back to it, I've had a greater hope than perhaps it's merited. So, I mean...
been appalled all over again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the late 90s with UK Gold, then 2006, then if that's when it was for the DVD, and then round about 2013-14 with my daughter, and then this time. So it's about every 7 years. Yeah, I think I certainly won't watch it in the next 7 years. Look, there's a great story to be told about the TARDIS going wrong and trying to alert the Doctor and companions, but unfortunately this isn't it. Or at least, if it is it, then something's gone wrong, I guess, between the page and the screen.
It's both ahead of its time and very much of its time. So what's good about it is ahead of its time. The idea that TARDIS is semi-sentient, well, that's what a great idea.
Yeah.
But it kind of takes another 50 years for that to be paid off, doesn't it, properly? People pretty much ignore it, apart from the odd one-liner here and then, and eventually would have done nicely. So, yeah, David Whittaker is ahead of his game there. But on the other hand, what drags it down, well, one of the things that drags it down, is that it's also very of its time with... I'm not going to say that springs and the Doctor proudly saying a bulb will come on to tell him if there's a problem. It's also... it's got a big idea that's beyond science fiction. I mean, it's quite a big metaphysical sci-fi concept. This most advanced spaceship in the universe is not apart from on top of all of its other wonders that we're only just beginning to understand. It's also sentient, brilliant. But then it's just a load of cogs and rivets because David Whittaker doesn't understand science. I suppose you would be grateful there's not any mercury this week or static.
Static electricity, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's strange because the idea of, as you say, it's a very high concept idea that you have a machine that's so advanced that it's conscious and it's trying to communicate with these people that are in, that are inside it, and it's trying to communicate this message as best as it can, and that's a great concept. But the bathos, if that's the term I'm looking for, of the actual mechanics of how it goes is it's most peculiar.
It's not only underwhelming and incomprehensible, but it's just if its only problem was it didn't make a lot of sense logically or technologically, that we could forgive it. But it's not good drama. Nothing about the things that happen in this story, as a result of the central concept, is entertaining. So it doesn't work. That's why it doesn't work on either level. And I wish I could ask Mr. Whittaker what he was thinking, where he started, what the angle was. Did he start writing and then come up with start? It reads to me like he started writing loads of spooky gibberish and piling up things that he hoped would be diverting, and then eventually realised he had to explain it. It feels like that, but I don't think they were writing that quickly that that would have needed to be the case. I think he genuinely thought it was a brilliant idea, and this was the best way to tell it. Unfortunately,
it seems like it's an unhappy fusion of improvisation and 1970s 3-2-1 dusty bin clues. Where they sort of they're sort of trying to explain at the end of how it all comes together. And they're all getting very excited about it, but none of it's making an awful lot of sense.
Oh, those poor actors. When you say improvisation, do you mean it feels like the actors are improvising it? Because that's...
Well, at the start, at times, it does, yes, I think.
Oh, that's what I thought. It doesn't feel, fundamentally, and this is unforgivable, it doesn't feel like it's been written by a real professional scriptwriter. Or even an unprofessional scriptwriter. It feels like an improvisation by a group of rather overwrought actors who all think they're preparing something very profound for the Edinburgh Festival or something.
Well, this is, according to the production notes, unless I'm misremembering this, they did say that the actors, the cast, at least on episode 1, they got together and they were paring it down during rehearsals and removing as much dialogue as they could. And trying to make it Pinteresque. The dreaded word Pinteresque crossed the across the screen on the captions.
I can see why they would have wanted to do anything to add a sheen of respectability or something artistic to it, but it didn't help, did it? I think it probably made it worse. It's difficult to know. I haven't, without seeing a version which is a bit more nuts and bolts and perhaps maybe a bit tighter logically. Without seeing that version, I don't know whether I'd have preferred it to this. Frankly, I think it's unlikely. There's not much I like less than this, what we're given here, no matter whose fault it is.
Yeah, it's not so much Pinteresque as sort of Pointer-esque. It sort of feels like they've maybe had a couple of pints, come up with something that everyone's got very excited about, and then it hasn't quite panned out in the.
I mean, it is all very juvenile, isn't it? This obsession with scissors. It is like you've got a load of sixth form actors or something in a room with a load of props, and they all grab it. And when you get a certain type of amateur actor, or not necessarily amateur, but a certain type of actor in a room and getting to improvise,
lovely Carol with her scissor acting there.
They go to violence, don't they, and shouting and hysterical argument. I mean, my least favourite thing from early Doctor Who is hysterical Susan, which we had to put up quite and more than enough with in the first two stories. And here, that's almost all we get. And then it spreads. Then we get hysterical Barbara and
which is, I mean, that's the worst part of it actually, because I mean, generally Jacqueline Hill seems quite sensible, but in this one, it all just goes a bit. Well, I mean, to be fair, she's better in episode 2, but in episode 1, it just goes a bit weird for about 15 minutes, doesn't it? And everyone's just screaming
at clocks.
Well, yes, apart from Ian, who's sort of chuckling away and appears to think he's I'm not quite.
He goes from
I'm not quite sure
phases.
what. Yes, yeah.
He's the worst at the beginning. He's the one who comes off worst for the first 10 minutes because he's doing sinister acting, which nobody else is. So
is he meant to be sinister?
I think so.
Right. Okay.
I don't think it's in the script, so I think he's decided that that's the way to play it. But as of yet, nobody else has got that memo. And then when he stops, he ends up having to hysterical Caroline Ford. No, watch it again. I'm sure that's what he's up to. He's playing everything in a slightly weird way.
Oh yeah, you're right. There is weird acting too, isn't there?
It's weird. Yes. It's weird, but I found it more funny ha-ha than funny peculiar. I don't know, but not particularly funny ha-ha.
Almost, yeah. What's the line even? And then almost the complete opposite when he is it Barbara suggests that something may have got in to the TARDIS, and he says, "What do you mean, like a like an animal or a man?" And he. I got the feeling that on paper he was supposed to be genuinely unnerved by the suggestion, but he decided to play it as if he thought it was ludicrous, and then overplays that completely as well. It's often difficult to tell, I think, at the time and in hindsight, whether at any given moment characters are in possession of their faculties or not. Are they acting out of character because they've been possessed this moment or lost their minds, or are they just hysterical? And it's I don't know how much rehearsal he did. Do you think? It just feels to me like they haven't still quite settled on a decision for any given moment.
Because that first 10-15 minutes, it feels like everyone is out of character, and then suddenly there's a recording break roughly, and then everything snaps back into okay. Suddenly they're all having much more grounded conversations about the situation, and that they all at least appear to know who each other is. And and you've got the whole thing of them not recognising each other at the start.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
So you start off with that. Yeah, have they lost their memories?
He's just. If you look back at everything that happens, in light of the explanation at the end that the TARDIS is trying to warn them, there's still quite a lot of stuff that goes on that isn't explained. Why does the TARDIS make them all forget each other, or is it that it knocks them unconscious and that's a side effect of being knocked unconscious? But I still don't think we get a good enough explanation of why it decides to knock them out and create a deep gash in the Doctor's forehead.
I mean, I guess going back to the actors and the method. I mean, to me, it's not so far removed from what we talk about in season 17. Where the wilder excesses of the Nightmare of Eden or the Horns of Nymon. It feels like they're having a bit of fun. I mean, if you look at the on the DVD the documentary that comes with it, you get William Russell and Caroline Ford. They're talking with a bit of relish about getting the chance to act, and there's definitely a set of inverted commas around act when they say it. But I mean, actually, they get the chance to act every week. It's only this time that they go utterly mad, and the results are a little embarrassing.
It is a little embarrassing, particularly Susan.
Should we? And the genesis of this story, and just for the legend, and the one that all have found and believed for decades. I think probably because we all picked it up from those early issues of Doctor Who Weekly. Masterpiece written in crisis, or some similar thing is ringing a bell from some recollection of it, which probably Jeremy Bentham of this parish was possibly responsible for that particular version of it. So the legend, which then everyone on the behind-the-scenes documentary has presumably been told this so many times at conventions over the decades since, that they've absorbed this, and that is the version that they believe, including Wallace Hussein, strangely enough, who's taking the blame for, I was hopeless and we were all running behind, and so they needed to insert this thing at the last minute into... Yeah, so supposedly the version is that Marco was running behind and they needed to put in a filler, the sets weren't ready, and so David Whittaker hammered this out over a long weekend, over hot tub and coffee, really. But the reality of it, and this is where I'm hoping someone else might have also read up and maybe read a bit further than I did, because... So my understanding of it is the reality of it is this was commissioned because they needed to have a block of 13 that ended on the conclusion of a story, because that was the only commission that was the initial commission, and although they'd already commissioned, so this is what I can't figure out is where did there not being a war go away and there being a war come along, to quote Baldrick. So why did it have to be written in a rush at that point? Because they commissioned Marco, they commissioned the Daleks. Or, okay, I guess they commissioned Masters of Luxor at some point, but they knew there was going to be a 2-episode gap. Did they not?
So I think that the reason... I can only see the reason they invented this anecdote about it being written at the absolute last minute to fill a gap, an unplanned gap, is because when you look at what they produce, you can't imagine that they would have done it deliberately or with any more in a decent amount of time. But it is rather boring. The truth is rather boring, and that's the last thing I remember reading. That as you say, it was a block of 13.
Yes.
But I just can't work out why they then why they still had the situation where Whittaker had to write it under pressure and was the only person who could write it, which was obviously, even at the time, looked down upon, sneered at as don't write for your own thing if you're the story editor. Well, because if they commissioned two up front, two on either side, as soon as they commissioned the Daleks, they must have known, well, hang on, we're going to have two. Yeah. We needed 2 parts straight after that before we go commissioning this Marco Polo nonsense.
What's very believable is that they're trying to cut costs. So possibly getting Whittaker to write it means that it's less costly than going outside to another writer. I don't know. I mean, it depends what they paid him for it. But then certainly, the reduced cast certainly is less costly. The usually the existing sets is less. So I mean, everything about it looks like they're trying to fit in the extra 2 episodes without splurging out very much money. And I suppose, I mean, although they have already commissioned the scripts and they are building sets for Marco Polo, perhaps there's still the opportunity for them to cancel before the recording happens if they're mad keen on this 13 episodes and that's it, without running to the cost of then having to pay the actors for the following one. So I don't know. I mean, it's just about plausible, I suppose, that they could have decided to up at the end of the 13.
I suppose it's an unforgiving brief to give to a writer from outside the fold to have to write a 2-parter with the if you've got the parameters that it's a 2-parter and it's also got to save a whole load of money because the props department has said no, you've got to write off the TARDIS costs over those 13 episodes rather than the 52 they'd sort of budgeted for or whatever. If you say okay, it's got to be a bottle episode just with the regulars, just with the one set and so on.
Do you think the idea of a bottle episode, whether it was called that or not, was a thing in television at that point? I mean, TV was even more long-running. Even ordinary programmes were much more long-running and bollocks soaps than they are now. So you'd have thought that would be something that they would have come across already in the TV industry. And yet, on the other hand, because a lot of TV was more theatrical, and you'd think that most scriptwriters were used to the idea of falling back on character stuff. When you haven't got anything else, any time, money, or or sets. And what I find most baffling about it, and you would think that, again, that's why you would give it to the script editor, You can't do anything new. You can't move anything on. All he's got is the existing characters, and so you think he's the ideal person to tell us some more about them, to consolidate what we've seen in the first 11 episodes, wrap it up with a nice neat bow. And in some senses, it does that, but on the other hand, it also is a complete and utter waste of time, because it's, as well, I don't think it tells us anything new about these characters. It muddles and confuses some of the things we already know, and in some ways contradicts things we've seen. It's a step backwards for the Doctor, because we've seen him start to mellow twice. I mean, we get the Cave of Skulls discussions, where they all air their dirty laundry in the first story, and then we get the same scene in the prison in the Dalek City, where he apologises to Barbara. So by the end of that story, I don't think we really needed to go through it a third time. And they were proper, genuine, they were very clear, dramatic situations that brought out, that forced the four of them to bond in those first two stories. Well, here we've got something completely contrived and ludicrous, where we never quite know who's... It's a bit like the way Cullen Baker was confused in Mind Warp, because nobody seemed to know when which bits were real and which bits weren't. I mean, they're all sort of acting like they don't know when they're possessed and when they're not. And so it just confuses things. It's also weird. I mean, it's also very bad television. The Doctor doesn't come across well. I was reminded of my favourite comment, Sidney Newman, having watched the pilot episode, "Old man not funny enough." He thought the Doctor was too stern and unpleasant in the pilot episode. What on earth would he think of this when he's threatened to chuck them out into space? I mean, maybe he'd moved on and wasn't reading every script thoroughly, or maybe... But you wouldn't have thought he'd have been very impressed with this. Yeah.
The strange thing is, and again, this is another thing that they all trot out on the making of documentary. They all say, "Oh well, because of the constraints and so on." We thought, well, let's do a character piece and explore the characters. And yet the idea in principle of doing that, if you've got these constraints and let's do a character piece, and yet it spends half the time making the characters completely unlike the characters we've come to know over the past 11 weeks, and just doing all this weird stuff with them. So
David Whittaker is not an incompetent writer. So if he wanted to write a character piece, he would have done it. He'd put them in a situation where they could be themselves. It's not the last time he writes a bottle episode, is it? There's one at the beginning of Wheel in Space with just the Doctor and Jamie, where the TARDIS is doing peculiar things.
Yeah.
Well, they're perfectly in character in that. I don't think he was trying to write a character piece. He was trying to write a bit of psychological, avant-garde, theatre of the absurd horror, for some reason. At this early stage of the programme. Well, forwards, backwards, sideways. Was this one of their sideways stories? I know they really wanted to do their Minuscules episode, didn't they, at this stage, but they couldn't work it out. So instead we have a trip into Sideways universe where nothing makes sense, but continues not to make sense.
And I think that's the thing about the first episode. I mean, and in some ways there's nothing. And it is weird. It's divorced from the others, but it's in the fine tradition of the first episode of Hartnell where everything's a bit weird.
Yeah.
And you're thrashing around trying to work out what's going on. Only that's extended to the lead characters because of the scenario, and we don't get a second episode that makes all that much more sense of it. It doesn't settle down into a. And the second episode seems better to me. I breathed a sigh of relief, possibly just at the superior quality of the video recording.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah,
it's odd that the debut director seems to do a better job.
Oh, and
it's interesting.
The actual direction, yes, yeah.
Yes, but I mean the curious thing is that in the making of, there's all this talk about the shadows in the first episode, but I mean I can't see any shadows at all. I don't know if it's to do with the fact that the DVD has, the processing to make the picture look sharper has somehow removed something that people could see in the old film copies. But to me, it seems quite bright most of the time. I mean, if anything, it's more shadowy in the second half.
Yeah, there's a very good bit with shadows right at the end, isn't there, of the second episode,
indeed.
Where Hartnell is, for no particular reason, bathed in light in the darkness. The first episode is just flat, like everything else Richard Martin ever did.
Yeah.
But at least it seems marginally less incompetent. But it's got one big open set, so even he can't.
Yes.
Well,
he starts at the start of the episode. It's Leisure Hive-esque. There's a pan right round the console room, which takes very nearly as long as the Leisure Hive to get from one end to the other. And then Barbara gets up in her foul trousers and starts talking. But I thought, well, I mean, it's not especially stylistic, but it's certainly a thing.
Is the melted clock in the first episode?
Yes.
Because they bollocks that up twice. I mean, you can't see what's happened.
No.
Well, 3 times if you include the fact that Barbara unnecessarily becomes hysterical outside of a melted clock. But I mean, because there's such a baroque design, you can't see what's happened, that the numbers have melted. And then Ian cuts to Ian's watch, but that's out of focus because the camera isn't quite in the right place. So that's completely and utterly bungled.
Yeah.
But at least it's redeemed by the fantastic explanation an episode later. We had time taken away from us and then given back to us because we're running out of time. I'll have what she had.
I mean, let's face it also, I mean, most of the monitors at that stage were, about 12 inches and very fuzzy, so the chances of anyone being able to see anything on that's pretty minimal anyway.
Well, what do we like about it? Those beds. They're quite...
Yeah.
I like the
very
strange...
space age.
Yeah, they look like good for your back. Very ergonomic. They can't have been specially made, can they? No doubt somebody has discovered where they came from.
But
we haven't read it. Whereas the food machine looks a bit...
Where's that Shares of Doctor Who website? Does it extend to beds?
You know it exists.
Does it extend to beds of Doctor Who?
I'll tell you what I like about this. What I like about this is that somebody watches it, looks at Carol Ann Ford and says, yeah, what we don't need in this series is any more alien acting. Let's get her to do ordinary 1960s girl. That'll be great. Because, what we get from here on in, I mean, it may not be very exciting for Carol Ann Ford, but it does at least, it's less embarrassing.
True. Well, until she gets a migraine in Reign of Terror, or whatever goes on there.
Yeah.
And decides that having a having a head chopped off, that's the cure for a headache. rather than attempt to escape.
Okay, and then other good moments. I mean, there's some quieter moments towards the end of the first episode where the Doctor and Ian are chatting, and then particularly, I suppose, the Doctor's monologue and then his discussion with Barbara at the end of the second episode. I mean, both of those are nice moments. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but at least you sort of feel like there's something a little bit more useful and important happening in those exchanges.
It's very badly written dialogue, mostly, apart from the odd little moment. The handful of bits when they are in character, they're good. But all the stuff where they're out of character and the stuff related to the dilemma they're in, the way it's presented to us and the way it's explained away is all rubbish. Very, very poor. There's no cause. It's an endless sequence of people saying things with no real cause and effect, but reacting to each other as if they're following on, as if they've just been inspired by what the last character said. Yes, of course, because... And then they say something that makes no sense, and then another person picks up the thread. And that just goes on and on and on. Maybe he did write it in a weekend.
Which is just like improvisation, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why... Yes, I mean, I wasn't being unnecessarily sarcastic when I said that's how it feels. It doesn't feel like it's had a second draft, but I don't understand how any professional writer could write something that has this little flow to it as a first draft. Unless you wrote it... You'd have to write it faster than it takes to watch. if you took any more than 25 minutes to write one of these episodes, then your brain would have time to think through the connections from one line to the next, and it clearly hasn't. It's just absolutely baffling. Anyway,
I definitely saw references to doing second drafts, at least in the second episode, or redrafts. So
the music, I like the music. We get it in the again in the moon base.
It's that bloody bit from the moon base, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, where have I heard this from? And,
Giles, do you think there's any reason why they don't use nice, proper space photography? Oh, hang on. No. I suppose you wouldn't have, in that era, you wouldn't have had anything better than just no.
Well, it's a bit like the Clangers.
They're just guessing, aren't they?
Yeah, kind of.
When they keep saying that's not really outside, that's just a photograph.
Yes.
Which is true a couple of times, but then we devolve, don't we, to sort of children's storybook illustrations.
And that's the thing. I mean, people were capable of doing decent space art at the time, and being a bit of a, the Chesley Bonnestells of this world were hammering out stuff that looked amazing. And you look at the start of A Matter of Life and Death, for instance, that amazing first 30 seconds or so. It's an amazing film anyway, but the first bit with the whole. I'm not sure who does the voiceover for the start of it, but it sounds like it's sort of Oliver Postgate. I'm sure they were inspired when they came to do the clangers, because there's the whole panning sequence about this is the universe big, isn't it? Pans over glorious starry vistas, and then zooms in on Earth in David Niven.
The planet Quinis of the fourth universe.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, yeah. Let's go there. That'll be more exciting.
Dare I point out that Big Finish have done that?
Right.
Quite a long time ago now. Mark Platt wrote it.
Yeah, okay.
I think for a long time nobody's allowed to write any stories in the Doctor Who universe set before Unearthly Child.
That rings a
But
bell.
at some point that must have been relaxed because he... Now, where did it fit in? Did they do a run of stories set before, and that was one of them? Anyway, I can't remember. But, it was by Mark Platt, so of course it was good. I'm going to quickly check that it was Mark Platt.
It's... these days it's very de rigueur to go before the Unearthly Child, but yeah, no, it's nice to make a reference and to think that there's stuff that's happening before we see them. Even if it's unclear precisely what that is. I mean, why they do a bit of travelling and then they settle down for quite a long time on Earth, long enough for her to go to school, and then they're off doing travelling again. But maybe they're just wintering or something.
Well, because Susan is such a wuss that she screams like crazy at anything slightly out of the ordinary they run into. So 1960s London is the best they can do.
Yes. I
seem to remember when we did an Unearthly Child commenting on the fact that Susan says about her, I like walking home in the fog.
Yes.
It's so dark and mysterious, and I think this is a side of Susan's personality, a level of bravery we never get to see before. She actually likes this sort of thing.
After that, it's all sort of fog.
Fog, exactly. Grandfather. A couple of things that occurred to me. I'd have to push myself back through it again. There were a couple of moments where I think the production notes mentioned the poltergeist aspect of it, and I thought, maybe there's something you could get your teeth into there, but it doesn't go down that route, really. But the whole thing of Susan being the most affected by it all, and again, there's a more effective tale. You could probably tell whether there really is something that gets into the TARDIS or...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking. From the moment they brought that up,
and
knowing that isn't where it goes.
Yeah, that was the story you wanted to be watching.
Yeah, I mean, this should be better than that, because this has a twist. This raises the spectre of it being a boogeyman has broken in and is stalking you. But actually, we've done something much cleverer than that. In a sense, it's quite like a new series episode where they promise you something. They promise you vampires and give you space fish. It's trying to be. It's clever. It's much better than what you thought we were going to give you. But really, 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 this is the one time when you really would rather have that. And if you wanted to be a psychological horror, then if something gets inside the characters' heads in turn, then there are two things you can do with that. You can have the way they behave oddly being in character, reflecting who they are, and they are all very distinct people. Or you could have the way they get out of it, the way they deal with the situation, reflecting who they are.
Yes.
I'm really not sure there's very much that separates them. Separates Ian, the brave science teacher, and Barbara, the plucky history teacher, and whatever Susan's supposed to be. She's just hysterical Susan. It seems to suggest she defaults back to that state, rather than that this is something new for her.
I suppose Barbara is most affronted by the unfairness of it. That seems to be the thing that comes out from her character. Ian is more sort of, that doesn't strike him quite so much, but Barbara, she's absolutely affronted.
Is it supposed to be unfair when early in the second episode Susan walks to the doctor's side and says, "Yes, Ian and Barbara, you have been behaving very oddly." And of course, one thinks they have. But even the doctor has the brass neck not to pick her up on that. But I don't know whether... You see, the thing is, that might just be, as you say a sign of the unfairness that we're supposed to really sympathise with Ian and Barbara here. Or it could just... But it feels to me more like the writer has forgotten who's done what so far. That's what it feels like. Rather than a character point. Anyway, I've got a suggestion.
Go on then.
I had one tiny little idea of how to improve it, and it is tiny, so it may not do very much, because I think mostly it's a bad idea and it shouldn't have been written. But because it's just a chain of incomprehensible things happening with a very weak payoff at the end, the fast return switch thing, which is his wonderful big idea, doesn't really land because it's plucked out of thin air. So all you do is you open part one with the Doctor then discussing where they're going next. We want to go home. Okay, says the Doctor, I shall press home, straight back to where we came. I shall press this switch will get us there, the fast return switch. You set that idea up, and you've instantly made it several times better, in my opinion, if anyone remembers that at the end.
Right.
Chekhov's fast return switch.
Absolutely.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, it's a pretty basic rule.
Yeah.
If you're going to pull something from up your ass at the end of a story, that's fine, but it's fine if you get to the end and you make something up and you write it down and stick with it. But then go back to the first episode and write it in. Just put a little margin note. Seed it earlier on. It doesn't take very long. And then it makes you look more competent. And may even help the pill go down more easily. The bitter pill that is the edge of destruction. Yeah, told you it wasn't much, didn't I?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to think is, I mean, he writes another 2-part story, David Whittaker, in the next season, the Rescue, which is also, I mean, there's a couple more characters in it, but you know, it's also relatively contained to a few sets and so on. And perhaps you might say it's not exactly the most exciting story in the history of Doctor Who either, but at least there's kind of some sense to it.
Yeah, and it achieves its goal of introducing the new companion. You get to understand who she is in 2 episodes, so that you can then carry on from the next week and pretend she's been there forever, which is obviously the point of it, so that you don't have to do big rewrites on subsequent stories, other than crossing out Susan and writing in Vicky. Or Tanny, or whatever her name was. Crossing out several names before you finally arrive at Vicky.
Yeah, one funny thing, because I'm talking about Barbara and Ian, and I feel like Ian doesn't exactly get much to do, it doesn't feel like. And they pile like the character stuff onto, such as it is, onto Barbara. That she's the one that the Doctor has to make it up to at the end. So apparently the whole stuff about time being given back to them, time being taken away and time being given back, which Barbara figures out apparently that was swapped dialogue, that they swapped that from Ian to Barbara, so Ian would have figured that out, which feels more like that was the science teacher's bit, as it were, and apparently they decided to swap it because it made more of Barbara's intuition.
Well, that's a nice way of saying that it makes no logical or scientific sense. So giving it to somebody who's supposed to be scientific might look a bit odd. So you give it to somebody who's actually quite a woolly thinker. Then again, and then call it women's intuition. So it might be a character point for her. But
you and your woman's intuition, Steve. Yes. Say a fan of Paul Temple.
Ian does get to throttle the Doctor, so I mean there is that.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah.
He doesn't get. He gets a very fetching dressing gown, doesn't he? He doesn't get to wear the bizarre robes of sleep, though, that Susan and Barbara both.
It nearly gives us a flash.
Yeah.
Not that I was looking too closely, but.
And it is only 388 lines. Yeah.
We're in grave danger of talking about this story for longer than it exists on celluloid.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of things that I do appreciate, it's interesting. It's another glimpse of one of these things where it doesn't. It's like the what might have beens and things like that. The fact that there's a vestige of the telepathic link thing between the Doctor and Susan.
Yeah.
The stuff like that. Some of the stuff to do with how the TARDIS console operates appears to be, and obviously that's stuff that is built on, and we'll be doubtless talking about that later. But it was quite interesting from the notes that again, it's all stuff I'm cribbing from production notes, but that apparently the original intention of Vachach.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, him anyway. That fella, the guy who designed it. The console was going to rise up at the start of flight and rotate, but it wasn't going to go up and down. It was apparently that was the intention. Was it kind of came up and was a navigational instrument with stuff going on inside it, and then it sunk down again when the TARDIS landed, but it wouldn't have done the old rise and fall thing inside, which is intriguing. And the whole thing of the power source under the console is obviously in terms of things I did actively liked about it. I like the one thing that's retrospective is I quite like the idea that the Doctor gets affronted at the idea that the machine can think. And the idea that it's the companions that first give him that idea, and that he sees it as just a machine until they, it's a retrospective fan thing, undoubtedly. But it's quite nice to see that the Doctor thinks no, it's just a ship, and just a machine until the idea gets planted by them.
Yes.
I do like the way they handled the return to normality when the power comes on and the hum starts up, the rising hum to gradually eventually reach the normal pitch. I do think that's very well handled, quite effective. And the other thing, from a complete nerd point of view, rare example of Whittaker science getting it right. The Doctor's whole soliloquy is overacted somewhat, though it is. It's strangely foreshadowing, like the theory of collisional accretion, which actually wasn't something that was in the mainstream at the time. It was kind of the whole thing about how the solar system formed.
Right.
Kind of was formulated in the early 70s. The whole model of like going from little atoms and gradually clumping everything together in more and more bigger chunks.
What is it? Oh, I wish I could remember exactly how he puts it.
So that tickled me slightly, that I thought, oh, funny, that's fairly bang on the nail compared to theories that were around at the time. Better than the planets being pulled out of the sun by the tidal force of a passing comet, or other things that were going around at the No, maybe that's a bit earlier than that. Who's the Waltzing Collision guy? Velikovsky was the crazy pseudoscience guy. Anyway, sorry. I'll belt up about that now.
Thank you.
Hang on, I just got to write something with a felt tip pen on my keyboard. Fast returns, switch. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to remember that best part of 60 years ago that knowledge was a little bit different. Anything else that anyone's got on this?
Nope. I'm not going to say another word because I refuse to talk about a story for longer than its own length.
One other thing, sorry. I'm just going
go on.
I'm determined to talk about it for longer. No, not at all.
I think Ian Levine's documentary is longer than the story itself, isn't it? So,
sorry, again, this is a slight. Oh, did Ian Levine make the documentary for the making of?
I think it's an hour long, unless that's the Genesis of the Daleks one. Maybe they both are. Or maybe I'm talking out my hat. Maybe I only
watched the.
Or is it completely the opposite of what I just said? There is no documentary, but there is. No, hang on.
No, there is a big one on there. I only watched the short. I only watched the 30-minute one, and I think it's about 30 minutes. That's just on the making of this story.
My mistake. That's the Dan Hall era. He wouldn't have let him get away with that much, would he?
But this actually relates more to the documentary than to what was shown. And again, it's just one of those things that it's funny in retrospect watching something that was made in about 2005, 2006. The fact that all the people they interviewed are willing to, or the ones who opined about it, fans and actors, discuss and treat the idea that Susan might not be the Doctor's actual granddaughter as like a viable theory at the time. And you think, and that was a bit of a throwback, because I thought, God, it's ages since I've heard anyone seriously give that opinion these days. You know, we're so steeped in 17 years into the new series now. The idea that the Doctor had a family and so on is absolutely just taken for granted. And the idea that there was a time where people said, "Well, is she really his granddaughter?"
Okay, so do you want to plough on with the other one, or do you want to have a bit of a break and come back to it?
Wouldn't mind quickly making a cup of tea.
Yeah, okay.
Back in a minute.
See you in a mo. We've retained our original lineup. Oh no, we haven't. I just say, well, that's a pretty fast return, isn't it? Just in case the first one didn't work out, because that's kind of.
You're going to put a trombone. You're going to put a trombone in there. Quite a nice joke. It made me laugh.
Yeah.
Oh God! Unlike the real thing.
Okay.